This is the miter saw, radial arm saw, or chop saw, and I'm going to read through the safety guidelines for the saw. Do not use the miter saw if you are too tired, hungry, sad, mad, or dehydrated. Never work while under the influence of drugs, alcohol, or any medication that creates drowsiness or impaired thinking. Never use the miter saw until you have been trained on and understand the safety issues and procedures specific to use of the miter saw. Obtain advice from your instructor or woodshop manager if you are not thoroughly familiar with the operation of the miter saw. Plan ahead, think of the sequence of cuts that need to be made. Keep your wood as long as possible for as long as possible so you're not working with very small pieces of wood. The minimum length is 12 inches. Think about where your hands are going to be before, during, and after the operation. Pay attention to your gut feeling, or that little voice in the back of your head. If something doesn't feel right, or if an operation feels dangerous, then it probably is. So stop and think it through, or talk to your instructor or woodshop manager. There's probably a safer way to do the operation if it doesn't feel right. Always wear eye and ear protection when using the miter saw. We'll all be wearing a mask, so that shouldn't be a problem. Do not wear loose clothing or gloves. Remove watch or jewelry and tie back long hair or beards. Like all machines, you must give the miter saw your undivided attention during the use. Once you have begun making a cut, you must keep your complete focus on that operation until the cut is complete. Do not look up at activity that may be happening around you or engage in conversation while making a cut. Check that the miter saw is in good working condition. Get into the habit of doing a pre-flight checking procedure. Keep in mind that you do not know who or for what the saw was used prior to your arrival at the saw. The following should be checked before the use. Is the area around the saw, the table, and floor clear of debris and scraps of wood? If not, clear it first before proceeding. Is the fence clear of the path of the blade? When making bevel cuts, make sure the fence has been slid away from the path of the blade. Be sure the fence is tightened down again after you move it. So one thing to pay attention to is that on this one, in general, we're probably making 90-degree cuts. So you want to make sure that this red line is lined up with 0 right here. And if it's at an angle, like this, it's not gonna make a 90-degree cut. So the way to move it is you lift this little notch right here, and you can drag it until the red line is lining up with the 0. And by pushing this down, that's locking the 90-degree cut that we want. Is the miter saw table secure? The handle should be in the lock position, which I just put it in, and then push down on the miter lock lever handle to lock the miter table in place. So now I can check and it's not moving. Is the bevel adjustment lock handle tightened? If not, turn the handle clockwise to tighten. Is the guard in place over the saw blade? So this is the guard. Every machine in the woodshop has a guard that's a safety mechanism. It's hiding all the teeth of a blade to make sure that if it's on, nothing is touching it. But as you lower the blade, the guard automatically comes up so that the teeth of the blade is going to cut into the wood. So this is the action that you should see with a miter saw. And there's a little lock here that you can't see in the video, but if the lock here is locked, then my saw is not gonna come out in this direction. And if you're cutting really wide boards, you will want the saw to move out in order to cover the whole width of the board. So if you're having trouble moving the saw out, you can loosen this adjustment, and now it should move the whole way. Check the condition of your wood. So this is the wood I'm gonna be cutting. It's a rough sawn piece of poplar, 6/4. Is it free of staples, nails, loose knots, splits, extreme bow, crook, dirt, paint, plaster, or excessive glue? So since this board is rough sawn, there's not going to be glue, and I'm just checking for, sometimes when you get a piece of lumber from the lumberyard, there can be staples on the edge or on the end grain, and you just want to make sure that there's no staples because you don't want any metal touching your blades. It will damage the blades, and yeah, we just don't want to damage the blades. Do not cut anything other than wood without the approval of your instructor, studio manager, or monitor. Be certain that the board is against the fence and touching the table at least where it's being cut. So when you get your piece of lumber, we usually cut the ends off, cut up the end grain, because usually the board you get will be painted, and when it's painted you can't see where the cracks are. So you want to get a clean cut first. So let's say I'm cutting off this end. I want to make sure that I choose a face to rest on the table that's more stable. So I'm going to see how stable this is. I'm going to see how stable this was. So this is bowing this way, which is going to be a lot less stable. Like there's a lot more, it can move a lot more easily. So I've decided that this face on the table is more stable. And this edge looks good enough to rest against this metal fence. The wood should be as flat as possible and have reasonably straight edge to go against the fence. This is the fence we're resting. Keep hands out of the path of the blade. Never cut a piece where your hand would be 6 inches or less from the blade. So if your board is like very short, you don't want your hand ever this close. Find a safe way to secure the work, as it must be held onto the tabletop and against the fence during the entire cutting process. Never cross arms in front of the blade. So you should never have a situation where you're holding the work like this. In general, you want left hand against the fence, right hand pulling down on the trigger and cutting the wood. If you are left-handed and that's not as good, right hand against a piece, against the fence, and left hand down on the trigger. There should never be anything that looks like this or this. For the sliding compound miter saw, if cutting anything wider than 4 inches, use an out, down, back motion with the real lock knob loosened. Pull the saw out toward you, lower the saw down toward the workpiece, and push the saw back to complete the cut. Do not allow the saw to come in contact with the top of the workpiece while pulling out, as it may cause the blade to run toward you. So the biggest thing I see people do with this operation is that sometimes they pull the trigger when the blade is too close to the wood. Or in general, you want to start the blade while it's not touching the wood. Start it, go all the way down, go all the way back, This whole time I'm pulling down on the power. And I come up and that's when I lift the trigger. So I'm just gonna demonstrate this without cutting the wood and just turning on the piece, turning on the machine. So I'm gonna start. Another thing I see people do a lot is that they release the power while the blade is still in the wood. In which case it's also gonna kick back at you and it's gonna be scary. So just make sure you're starting the blade way in advance, coming all the way out, starting, going all the way down, holding down the power, going all the way to the back, holding down the power, and then you release. You must have control of the piece of the wood that you're cutting by holding, clamping, or some type of jig to secure the piece. For this class, we'll probably just use our hand. Everything we're cutting is pretty big. Never force the blade through the cut. Stop and figure out where the resistance is coming from and fix it before proceeding. Allow the motor to reach full speed before cutting. I've gone over that already. But with the mini bunch tops, they're gonna be kind of thick, so it'll be a good practice to cut it in 2 passes instead of 1 full pass. Especially if you have a board that's very crooked, because it might just pinch on you and kick back. Use a steady feed rate when cutting. Go neither too fast or too slowly. So the time when I turn on the machine and I did the whole motion, that's how slow you want to go. But you also don't want to go too slow because it takes up time. Never place one piece of wood on top of the other. Cut one piece of wood at a time. So I don't want to have 2 pieces like this or cutting to both pieces. Only cut 1 piece at a time. Don't move either hand from the saw or workpiece or raise the arm until the blade has stopped. This is especially true if the offcuts are small, as they may become projectile if the saw arm is raised while the blade is still spinning. Do not stand directly in front of the path of the blade. So I'm standing, I'm more to the side of the blade, I'm not right here, more to the side. Do not reach behind or underneath the saw unless it is turned off and unplugged. Remember, saw blades will continue to spin for several minutes after the motor has been turned off. Do not perform any operation freehand. The workpiece must be supported by the table and against the fence. I don't know why anyone would do this, but make sure, like, you don't want to cut a wood that's floating in the air. You always want it down on the saw and pushed against the fence. For the radial arm saw of cutting a board wider than the capacity of the saw, cut a little past halfway, then turn the board over and finish the cut from the opposite edge. So let's say this piece is too wide. You can cut it through half this way, and then you can turn it, and the cut half is on that side, and now you can cut it again this way. Or you can cut it this way and then flip it and then cut it again. So I'm just going to demonstrate cutting off like a tiny bit on this piece, pretending that this is the piece we're going to work with. So before I cut, I also just want to have my blade touching without turning it on, just to make sure I'm cutting where I want to cut. And now that I know it's good, I'm going to put my arm and I'm going to do the full cut. So as you saw there, I was having the blade run here, all the way down, all the way back. It's still running, I lift, and then I lift the power knob. And then now I'm going to demonstrate if if I was to take 2 passes instead of 1. Let's say if this board is very bold, that's something you would want to do.